For Eric J on Sports, I'm Eric J, and this is what I think. Every sports fan knows by now that Chris Paul, CP3, the point guard, the future Hall of Famer, was released by the Los Angeles Clippers as they were waiting to board a plane in Atlanta after a game that they had lost. And when I say that they have lost, that's not a surprise because the Clippers have lost quite a few of them. But Chris Paul was waived by the team, and supposedly it was at the behest of general manager Lawrence Frank. Now, that's not a surprise that players get cut because players get cut all the time. But usually what happens when a story like this breaks is everybody races to be first with a comment, everybody races to be first with an opinion, everybody races to be first to have their hot take. But I don't. I've heard a lot of comedians say that when bad stuff happens, they have the jokes ready that night. And a lot of the sports broadcasters and analysts try to do the same thing. Something bad happens, they try to put together an opinion right away. But I like to sit and wait and hear things come out and see stories come out and get other perspectives and find out who's saying what and why. And the reason I feel that way is because when you do that, you learn more about the players involved in a story. At the beginning of this story, it was Lawrence Frank released Chris Paul, and there may have been a situation where Chris Paul's leadership style was not well received by the veteran Clippers as much as it was by the younger, more rookie-laden San Antonio Spurs last year, primarily because they were younger players and Chris Paul was a starter for 82 games. Now with the Clippers, there's a bunch of veteran guys, Kawhi Leonard, James Harden, Brook Lopez, Bradley Beal, and Chris Paul was coming off the bench. So why would you listen to a bench player if you're a starter playing starter minutes on a team that has championship aspirations? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But supposedly the story was that his leadership style wasn't well received. And that's neither here nor there. But if you've got a coach like Greg Popovich and he brings in a Chris Paul and he allows Chris Paul to be Chris Paul, a veteran leader, then that's one thing. But if you've got a coach like Tyronn Lue and he brings in a Chris Paul, a veteran leader, and you don't let Chris Paul be Chris Paul, then that's another problem. But as I said, this isn't a hot take situation. I waited and I wanted to find out what the players were thinking and saying. And recently there was a story that was attached to the release that stated that Tyronn Lue, the coach of the Clippers, and Chris Paul hadn't been on speaking terms and hadn't spoken to each other for quite some time. So that story got explored a little bit more recently in an article where an interviewer asked Tyronn Lue if it was true that him and Chris Paul had not been on speaking terms. And what you do in life when you want to learn how to read and react to people is you pay attention to what they say, how they say it, and why they say it, if you can't always look at their expressions and their body language. So the question was asked of Tyronn Lue, are you and Chris Paul not on speaking terms? Were you and Chris Paul not on speaking terms? The response that Tyronn Lue gave was, well, I'm his coach. How can I put him in games and take him out of games if I'm not speaking to him? And that's an answer, but it sounds like an answer a sixth grader would give if you say to the sixth grader, or you ask the sixth grader, did you steal that boy's lunch? Well, no, he wasn't sitting there at the table, so I just saw the plate and the food and took some. Did you hit that boy? No, we were playing and my hand reacted to his face. That's what that was. That was, well, I'm his coach. I got to tell him to go in games. I got to tell him to come out of games. So yeah, of course I was speaking to him. But that wasn't the question. The question was, were you and Chris Paul at a point in your lives where you could sit down and have a conversation? But the question was phrased, are you and Chris Paul on speaking terms? Or were you and Chris Paul on speaking terms? So instead of answering, were you and Chris Paul at a point in your lives where you could sit down and have a conversation, which was the intent of the question, which was the meaning of the question, Ty Lue answered the question. Were you on speaking terms? Were you speaking to one another? And he said, well, yeah, because I had to tell him to go in and out of games. The next question that Ty Lue was given was, have you reached out to Chris Paul since he's been released. And Ty Lue's response was, well, he hasn't called me either. And I've known a lot of people in my life. I knew a young lady once a long time ago who, the moment she would be involved with a person, whether it was a friendship or a romantic situation, if all of a sudden she went a couple of days without hearing from that person, she would make a decision in her mind. I'm not going to call them either, to see how long it takes before they call me. I've always thought that was stupid, because if you want to talk to somebody, you call them. If they don't call you back, then that's a different issue. If you're the only one calling all the time, then it's a one-sided relationship. But if you want to hear from someone, you call them or you reach out in some way. But as I said, Ty Lue's answer was a little petulant, because when you ask the sixth grader, did you hit that child? And the sixth grader responds with, well, he hit me first. That's not answering the question. The question was, did you hit him? The next question will probably have been, why did you hit him? And then when he says, well, he hit me first, then the next question would probably have been to the other child, why did you hit that child? Well, he threw a toy at me. Why did you throw a toy at him? Well, he threw a toy at me first. Why did you throw a toy at him? Because he stole my food. Why did you steal his food? Because he had walked away from the table and I just saw a plate of food and I thought he was finished, so I took some. And you get to the root of the issue. But when you ask Ty Lue, the coach of the team, who allegedly, supposedly had a problem with Chris Paul's management style or Chris Paul's leadership style because it was a disruptance to the team, at least that's what the stories were saying, and you ask Ty Lue, have you spoken to Chris Paul since he's been released or since he's been sent home? And your response is, well, he hasn't called me either. Then you sound petulant and you sound petty and you sound childish, but you're avoiding the situation. Because think about it for a second. I've been fired a couple of times in my life. And some of you who are listening to this probably have been fired a couple of times in your life. How many times after you were released from a job did you call your boss to say, hey, how's it going, brother? Hey, how's it going, hon? You know, just thought I'd reach out to you after you fired me to see how you were doing. How many times have you done this? How many people do you know have done this? Just reach out to your boss to say, you know what? I know you fired me. I didn't think I should have been fired. I felt like turning over a table and maybe punching you in the face. But I just wanted to see how you were doing because I know it's been a few days. It's been 5 days since you fired me, and I probably shouldn't still be angry about it. How many people have done that? But then the big question was, what got you guys to this point? What led to the relationship being irreconcilable such that Chris Paul had to go? And Ty Lue's response was, well, you've got to ask Lawrence Frank, the GM. So that means that Ty Lue is saying, I had nothing to do with it. It wasn't me. It was Lawrence Frank that felt like Chris Paul had to go. And if that's the case, then why can't you answer any of the other questions? Were you on speaking terms with it? Because then if Lawrence Frank was the one who felt like Chris Paul needed to be released, then you could say, yeah, me and Chris was fine. I don't know what happened. I don't know why Lawrence Frank felt like firing this dude. But you can't throw your boss under the bus because then you might be next to go, seeing as how the Clippers have one of the worst records in the league. So you don't want to throw your boss under the bus. So you say, yeah, that's between him and Chris. I'm out of it. But then at the same time, when they ask you, have you had a conversation with Chris since the release? And you say, well, he hasn't spoken to me either. You won't be throwing your boss under the bus if you say, yeah, I spoke to Chris and I've heard his side and I really don't know what the situation was. I just know that Lawrence Frank had to let him go. Nobody really asked him, have you spoken to Lawrence Frank, and asked him what the situation was, because once he says that's between him and Chris Paul, that's him saying, I don't want any part of it, so don't ask me any questions. So you look at all that and you go, well, you know, that means that Ty Lue is protecting himself. And that means that Ty Lue is trying to wash his hands of this situation and absolve himself of any wrongdoing. And you have every right to do that. But you just sound petty and childish when the questions are being asked and those are the answers that you're giving. You sound petty, you sound childish, you sound like somebody who's afraid for their life. And I get it. You don't want to be fired right alongside Chris Paul because your team stinks. And since Chris Paul has been let go, the team has lost more than it's won. So you really can't blame Chris Paul for a chemistry issue that was causing the losing. So who knows? Maybe Chris Paul was a detriment. Maybe Chris Paul was a cancer. Maybe his leadership style was rubbing the veterans the wrong way because it doesn't work the same as it does with the rookies and younger players that they had in San Antonio. Maybe Chris Paul just wanted to be boss, and the bosses didn't like not being the smartest guy in the room. I've been in a situation in corporate America where my boss didn't appreciate not being the smartest guy in the room, so he fired everybody who he felt appeared to be smarter than him. I've been in that situation, and just for the record, yes, I was one of the people that was let go. So, whatever the situation was, it was bad when it happened, and there were a lot of hot takes saying it was bad when it happened. But after this Ty Lue interview, you come to realize that it may not have been just Lawrence Frank, but Ty Lue is not going to tell you what really happened, at least from his perspective, at least from his point of view. So you'll never know what really happened. Unless Chris Paul writes a book, you'll never know what really happened. So I feel bad for CP. I feel bad for Ty Lue. I feel bad for the Clippers because I always want the Clippers to do well, even though I'm not a Clipper fan. I want the Clippers to do well. Because they live in a city where every other team in that city has prospered. The Lakers have championships. The Lakers have recent championships. The Dodgers have recent championships. The LA Kings have recent championships. The Sparks have recent championships. The Rams have recent championships. The Clippers and the Chargers are the black sheep of the family. So I want the Clippers to do well. But it doesn't appear that that's going to happen anytime soon. And unfortunately now, you can't blame CP3. Remember to like and share this video and subscribe to this channel, and visit the Eric J on Sports website, and follow me on Facebook at Eric J on Sports 1, and on Instagram and Twitter at Eric J on Sports. And for Eric J on Sports, I'm Eric J, and this is what I think.